My parents refused to help me through college. I still made it. Now they want me to pay for my sister's education. I was 19 the night I taught myself to be invisible. Not on purpose, at first it was just survival. My parents had been clear, no more money for college. We did our part, my father said from his recliner, the TV throwing blue light across his face. You want to go work for it? My mother, polishing a set of silver spoons she kept for company, didn't look up. We can't afford to throw good money after bad, she added, like it was an accounting lesson and not the last time they'd be willing to help their child take her first step into the world. They'd always had favorites. My sister Hannah had a smile that made them melt and an appetite for things money could buy. Music lessons and sat tutor, a college application consultant. Me. I asked about scholarships and cut my hours at work to study for the exams. I lied to friends about why I couldn't go out. I skipped summer camps. I learned to stretch ramen by adding eggs and frozen vegetables. I learned to check the scholarship portal every morning at 6 a.m., with the kind of devotion most people reserve for prayer. When the acceptance letter to State University arrived, my hands shook. It was a ticket not to an immediate, comfortable life, but to possibility. I auditioned for work study, took a job as a resident advisor, tutored at the learning center at night, and pieced together summer jobs that would let me stay enrolled. I took classes during the day and graveyard shifts at a coffee shop during finals week. I learned to sleep in 90-minute blocks. I learned to say no with a calm I didn't feel. I learned to scan the meal halls for leftover trays that students tossed because they were full. There's an art to combining 2 microwaved entrees into dinner and breakfast. There were humiliations, of course. Our house felt like a museum for my sister's achievements. When Hannah got her first scholarship, Dad bought her a new laptop and threw a backyard party. I clapped and stayed late to clean up the confetti. When I told them I'd been accepted with half tuition covered by a scholarship and half paid via work study, my mother pinched her mouth and said, "Is that enough?" Like enough was a measure they used to decide whether someone was worthy of being noticed. I did not resent them loudly. I learned instead to convert the anger into oxygen for something else. While my family chewed over decor for Hannah's grad party, I taught myself to code on nights when rain plastered the apartment windows. The library became my chapel, the blinking cursor my psalm. I swallowed pride when I took an unpaid internship building websites for a nonprofit. I said yes to every small job anyone offered. I learned SQL the way other people learn recipes, by repetition and dogged appetite. 2 summers before graduation, the internship led to a paying contract, a small company that needed a website and inventory system. I built it for them for a price that paid my rent and gave me enough left over to buy a second-hand car. I did it well. They gave me a recommendation. The recommendation turned into more work. Before I knew it, I had a few clients and a fledgling freelance business that could grow. The turning point, the exact moment the trajectory changed, was a rainy Tuesday my junior year, when a development shop in our regional tech hub messaged me after finding a small tool I'd built on GitHub and asked if I'd consult on a logistics problem. I said yes. I stayed late nights, debugged code until my eyes stung and learned to make data behave. At 23, a little startup offered to buy the tool I'd built. The deal wasn't headline-making, but it was life-changing. I had saved, then invested, then negotiated. I swallowed plenty of pride and hired help when the workload demanded it. I learned to run payroll and file taxes that weren't mine alone. I learned to treat people well because they'd stick with me when things got rocky, not because I could force them to. By 27, I'd sold the company for a sum that made the worries of my 20s look like small currency. I didn't crow. I rewired my life quietly. A mortgage in a modest Boston neighborhood, a comfortable savings account, scholarships for students back at my high school, and a small tech fellowship that paid forward the second chances I'd been given by a few kind strangers. I learned how to build wealth and how to make it mean something other than the numbers on a bank app. When I flew home for Thanksgiving the first time after the acquisition closed, my parents were polite but distant. They asked about the weather, which my new house didn't have to do with the bank account, and they remarked with that same thin pride, "We're glad things are going well for you." My sister hugged me and asked, with the practiced casualness of someone whose life is managed for her, whether I could help pay for her master's application. She'd already picked the one with the most campus photos on Instagram. It was absurd. A decade of me scraping and saving, of sleeping 4 hours and working 2 jobs. And the family that had refused to help me through college now expected me to cover the cost of my sister's degree because, in their phrase, we're all family. There's a phrase people like to toss when they want access to favors: family helps family. But family had not helped me when I needed it most. They'd told me to walk the rest of the way on my own. I sat in my childhood bedroom, the same bedroom I'd shared with posters that had yellowed at the edges, and listened to my father explain, in a tone he used to associate with budgets and invoices, that we could use some help with Hannah's tuition. My mother asked the subtle glance, "It would be nice if you could pitch in, your sister can't get loans the way you did." She said the words like a trap being set, like a mathematics problem that would add up precisely in their favor. I remembered all the nights I'd begged for help and been told, "You'll figure it out." I could still taste the bitter metallic tang of the words. I remembered the scholarship applications I'd filed at 2 in the morning, the time I'd sold my textbooks to pay rent, the letter I'd written asking for a measly contribution for a study abroad summer program, and the silence that followed as if the letter had been misdelivered. My instinct was petty and cold, pay them back for every nickel and then some. The better instinct, the one that had been slowly knit into me over years of hard bargains, was to hold on to what I'd built and use it, assuming responsibility only on my terms. So I did what I had learned during the long years of improvisation. I told the truth. I invited my parents to dinner at a small restaurant that I liked, the kind with mismatched plates and honest portions, and I told them calmly how their decisions had shaped me. Not in an accusatory lecture, but in a ledger of facts. Dates, unpaid tuition, years I'd worked 2 jobs to pay for classes, the one time my mother refused to sign a form because it was too expensive for us to help. I kept my tone level and took long sips of water. My father smiled in the way bullies smile when they sense weakness. "We did what we could," he said. "Everything else you managed yourself." "Yes," I said. "And everything I managed myself is what made me who I am. It's also the reason I can make a choice now." I slid a folder across the table, a compact, polite packet containing paperwork for a donation, a scholarship fund I'd set up at my old high school, earmarked for students with financial need and good grades. I'd seeded it with a sum that would cover a full ride for 2 students a year. "I'm not paying Hannah's tuition," I said. "But I'll continue to invest in the people who were in the position I was, the kids who don't have someone at home to co-sign their loans." My voice held none of the twitch of old anger. There was silence, the kind that falls like dust. My mother's hands tightened around her napkin. My father's jaw moved. They both looked genuinely surprised, perhaps because they had expected me to be grateful, pliant, and available on call. That was the trick people like them learned early: assume availability, then be shocked when it gets withdrawn. Hannah burst into tears, a practice performance, the sort actresses use when they mean to win. "How can you?" she said. "We're family." Her voice was small now, which made the ritual more effective to whoever was listening in the kitchen. "I know," I said. "And because we're family, I want to be sure my help actually creates opportunity, not dependency. I'll pay for a summer research assistant position for Hannah if she secures one that adds to her CV. I'll help her find internships and mentor her through applications. But I won't be signing her loans or paying full tuition. If she wants that, then let her apply for scholarships and work-study the way I did. Let her earn it and learn the things I learned. Then the degree will mean more than a check." You'd think the conversation would dissolve into agreement or teeth-clenched silence. Instead, the house turned small and loud. My father said bluntly, "You're being spiteful." My mother said, "If you love your family, you'd help." They'd weaponized the language of morality the way some people wield scripture. Use it to close a door in your favor. I expected, perhaps secretly hoped, friends to rally, colleagues to disbelieve the audacity of the demand. But the truth of these situations is quieter, more practical. People's loyalties are a series of pockets and neighborhoods. Some friends send notes. Some cousins text. A few of my old classmates, the ones who'd been at my side in dorm kitchens at 2 a.m., called to see if I was okay. I was. I was okay because I'd learned to be enough for myself, and to not measure worth by the degree of other people's generosity. That night after the dinner, I walked off the bitterness by wandering the riverfront near my apartment. The city lights blurred into a warm smear on the water. I thought of the various versions of family help I'd seen across years and stories, the ones that ask, Remember when you could as a way of getting people to hand over checks, and I thought of how I'd set up that scholarship fund. I thought of teenage kids hunched over a library desk, leaning into a problem for the first time because someone had covered their fees. I thought of the small victories, a student's face when they see a balance cleared on their account, a parent who can breathe again. Those were the investments I wanted to make. Those, more than immediate rescue, built the kind of dignity that sticks. 2 weeks later, Hannah's tuition letter arrived in my inbox. The university email said they'd found a gap in her account and would send a notice if it wasn't remedied by the end of the month. She texted me at 1:02 a.m., please. Urgent. I scrolled through the thread we'd had the night before and the messages before that. There was a pattern. She'd never suffered consequences. She'd always had a line to pull, a favor to tug. I thought about the consequences that shaped me and the way they taught me to build things that would last. I called her. Do you have a plan? I asked. She hesitated. No, she admitted. The honest answer had the same freshness as a cracked egg. For a moment I almost handed her the check. Old reflexes die hard. But I remembered the look on my father's face when I presented the scholarship plan. I remembered how often the easy handouts had taught my sister little except the currency of asking. Okay, I said. Then this is what we'll do. I'll help you find a summer internship and I'll help you prepare the application. I'll introduce you to a recruiter I know who might have a paid assistant role. If by the end of this month you can secure a paid placement or demonstrate a sound, independent plan, we'll revisit a bridge loan I'll co-sign with conditions. If you can't, we'll look at other options, including a payment plan through the university or taking courses at a community college for a semester while we get your finances in order. She blurted a string of half-pleases and thank yous. It was the type of gratitude my younger self would have swallowed and never questioned. But I didn't sign an immediate check. I didn't save her from consequences that might teach. Instead, I set a structure and parameters. Boundaries, I'd learned, are not cruelty. They're the difference between enabling and helping. The fallout at Thanksgiving was predictably dramatic. Whispers, shocked relatives, phone calls with habitual outrage. Some cousins called to applaud me. One aunt, the one who'd always hugged me at gatherings and remarked, "You're doing great, sweetie," sent a private message asking for the scholarship link so she could donate. A different cousin called my father, saying I was cold and ungrateful. My father, who'd called me spiteful, later called, and we argued in the way that only long-simmering family conflicts can argue, with old scripts and quick defensiveness. I don't owe you my money, I told him over the phone. I owe you nothing. I give where it matters and where it changes lives. That's my choice. He had no riposte. When you cut through the noise to the marrow, the older patriarchy of family expectations often has to rearrange its assumptions. People who have always expected to walk into someone else's accounts suddenly discover they need to ask, or to earn, or to be creative. That winter, Hannah applied for a paid internship at a nonprofit I'd referred her to. She showed up to interviews without the practiced entitlement my parents had instilled in her, and surprisingly to us both, she landed the position. She worked hard and was offered a part-time role that could cover a portion of her tuition that semester. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the comfortable route Dad had imagined. But for the first time, I saw her confronting challenges rather than assuming rescue. She bragged less about the party favors at her social gatherings and more about the small wins she'd had at work. Pride leaked through the seams in a better way, not the glossy family kind, but the one that comes with doing something on your own. 2 years later, the university awarded her a merit scholarship that covered a chunk of the rest. She still called me from time to time, sometimes to ask for help proofreading an application, sometimes just to say hello. Our relationship changed. The entitlement that used to feel like a demand softened into calls that had real content. We ate dinners together and I introduced her to my friends. She no longer assumed I'd bail her out. She sat across the table, sometimes shy, sometimes competent, and told me about interns she'd hired or mentees she'd guided. As for my parents, the rift didn't heal overnight. There were things I could not forget, the clipped refusals, the "you'll figure it out" letters tucked in kitchen drawers. But there was also a softer place where time and consistent boundaries did what lectures could not. I stopped being the family ATM and became instead a person with clear values. If they asked me for help, I asked them to explain how the help would improve someone's life rather than fill a short-term need. They grumbled. They adjusted. Over time, folks started bringing me different kinds of requests. A neighbor's child who needed a laptop for school, a teacher who asked whether I'd speak at a scholarship luncheon. I accepted the invitations that aligned with my values, practical help, mentorship, and structures that produced durable skills. I continued funding the scholarship at my high school. I set aside small grants for students who wanted to go to conferences, but couldn't afford the travel. I mentored, sometimes pro bono, and sometimes with the goal of helping young people create independence. Years from that Thanksgiving, when Hannah graduated and walked across the stage, our eyes met in the crowd. For a moment, she was the little girl who'd had a piano recital and a crowd of clapping adults. But she was also the woman who'd taken an internship, learned the ropes, and carried herself without assuming rescue. She mouthed a shaky thank you at me from the aisle. I did not stand, as some people expected, to proclaim that I had been vindicated. I simply clapped. This was not about winning. It had never been about that. It had been about translating pain into something that helped others. When I left the ceremony and walked into the winter light, I thought about every night I'd spent studying at the library, every pizza I'd eaten alone to save money, and the way small acts can compound into real outcomes. I thought about the scholarship recipients whose mothers cried when they got their tuition cleared. I thought about the small miracle of someone learning to breathe under a borrowed burden and then to stand. People will tell you, and I believed them once, that family is a debt you pay simply because of blood. That's a beautiful sentiment when it's reciprocated. But it's not always a moral imperative to empty your pockets and your dignity for people who can stand and won't. There's a difference between being generous and being taken for granted. There's also a difference between helping someone so they can grow and rescuing them so they remain stuck. The story didn't end with some cinematic vindication in front of the whole family. There were no dramatic lawsuits and no late-night phone calls asking for forgiveness that broke in sobs. There were small, quieter victories. A scholarship that funded a student's first semester, a sister who learned to earn a place in the world, a father who began to judge requests by the work involved rather than the feelings they aroused. There were also disappointments, phone calls I ignored, relatives who stopped speaking. But I slept better. I woke earlier. I coached students. I invested in programs that made a measurable difference. I kept my money and my heart where I thought they would do the most good. When people ask me how I did it, how I turned the kind of lack that would make most people bitter into something that sustained me, I point to the ledger of tiny decisions. Study instead of sleep, work instead of complaining, say no when the ask is selfish and yes when it builds muscle. I also remind people that success is complicated. It's not simply the sum of bank accounts, but the measure of what you keep and how you spend it. A few years after the dinner where I set the scholarship folder on the table, a small newspaper profiled the program and one of its graduates, a first-generation student who later became a teacher in the same district. My parents clipped the article from the paper and left it on the kitchen counter with a post-it note that said, "Interesting." I don't know if that counted as an apology. Maybe it was the nearest they could come. I left it there and made coffee. And when Hannah texted, months after graduation, to say she'd recommended a student for the summer mentorship I ran, I smiled. The circle had closed in a way I liked. She'd learned to pass the ladder down instead of waiting for someone to hand it to her. If there is a moral to all of this, and I'm wary of the kind of homilies that tidy up messy human lives, it's this: people will ask you to pay for things you don't owe. It's okay to say no. It's better to build channels that create independence than to feed endless dependence. And when you do give in a way that lasts. Scholarship funds, mentorships, opportunities, not in a way that merely fills the immediate quiet of someone's panic. When my mother asked me several Thanksgivings later why I'd never simply forgave and forgot, I gave her a short answer. Forgiveness isn't a swap for responsibility, I said. I forgave a long time ago. What I did after that was make sure my forgiveness built something. That's how I keep from being asked for everything and giving nothing that matters. She didn't answer. She washed the dishes. Outside, the evening hummed with the low thrum of the city. In that hum I heard my own breathing, regular and sure. I had taught myself to be invisible, and then to make the visibility of my actions count.